is apropos. Well, it marks one of the biggest turning points for the Middle East in generations. The fall of Bashar al-Assad has triggered celebrations across Syria and beyond at the dramatic end of 5 decades of his oppressive rule. The Syrian government fell after rebels seized the capital Damascus over the weekend, and Assad fled to Russia 11 days after the start of the militia's lightning advance. Residents cheered in the streets amid celebratory gunfire as rebel factions heralded the departure of Assad. With the latest, here's Antonia Kerrigan.
In the streets of Damascus, residents triumph over the toppling of Bashar al-Assad, climbing onto the tanks abandoned by his army, some describing a feeling of disbelief.
I can't describe the feeling. It's a dream we haven't woken up from yet.
A newfound sense of freedom after years spent in a climate of fear.
We were unable to talk about the fact that we were persecuted and living without dignity. Everyone who went abroad would tell us that there are such things as human rights, but we didn't see any of it. Hopefully, now the country will get better.
And some of those who left the capital at the beginning of the war have now been able to return. This one as a rebel fighter.
We smell the air of Damascus that we were deprived of. We were deprived of it for 13 years. We returned, thank God, and things are fine.
Hayat Tahrir al-Sham claimed the capital on Sunday after a 10-day-long lightning offensive that deposed the president. Residents celebrated the end of the Assad family's half-century-long dictatorship by looting the presidential palace, while this government immigration office went up in flames and this portrait of Bashar al-Assad's father torn down. The future is uncertain for Syria. What will life look like under the Islamist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham? But Syrians worldwide describe relief and optimism.
To discuss, we're joined now by Aaron Y. Zelin, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Thank you so much for being with us on the programme this evening, Aaron. Huge uncertainty for Syria, as we heard in that report, the start of a new era. But what kind of era?
I think that a lot could potentially play out still, based off of how we've seen Hayat Tahrir al-Sham govern already in the previous 7 or 8 years in Idlib province. It was an authoritarian governance model. So while not quite as bad as the totalitarianism of the Assad regime, it wasn't a liberal democracy by any stretch of the imagination.
How to unite though all these various rebel forces? They in turn, they're backed by rival international powers. So how exactly will a new government govern?
So far, it seems like at least HTS is able to consolidate in the western part of the country, where now in the east there's renewed fighting between the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army and the U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, the latter being the key player that the U.S. has worked with on the ground to fight the Islamic State. So it would definitely be disastrous if the SNA was able to take over territory from the SDF, because it could provide the space for the Islamic State to become a bigger problem once again.
Yeah, because there are concerns that the likes of the Islamic State will take advantage of the uncertainty currently in Syria and regroup. The rebels themselves, they claim to have broken ties with al-Qaeda and other jihadist groups. Have they?
Yes. HTS broke ties with al-Qaeda back in 2016. So we have an 8.5-year track record of them now being independent of any global jihadi interest, external operations, terrorism abroad. They've only focused on Syria, and there's no reason not to believe them, especially since when al-Qaeda tried to create a second branch in Syria called Qurasadin back in 2018. By June 2020, HTS was able to dismantle them, and we haven't heard from al-Qaeda in Syria since. So while they are not, global jihadis, the way I kind of describe it is that this transition went from them being involved in global jihad to now them being a local regime.
And we've seen throughout the day images of inmates being released from various prisons across Syria. There's thousands of jihadists also from the West and their families detained in camps in the country run by Kurdish forces. What happens to them?
Well, for now, in the areas that the Kurds run in northeast Syria, nothing has changed in terms of the administration. The U.S. continues to back the SDF, and the U.S. alongside the SDF continues to monitor and guard these prisons. There's 10,000 male Islamic State operatives imprisoned, and then you also have a few tens of thousands of women and children that were affiliated with them through marriage, or they're the kids of the fighters. And that's why it's more important than ever that Turkey stops the Syrian National Army from continuing to fight the Syrian Democratic Forces.
And what do you make of the reaction here in Europe? We've seen various Western capitals saying that they're going to suspend asylum applications from all Syrians. What do you make of that? They're saying it's due to the uncertainty. Austria going as far as to say that it's going to deport them back to Syria.
Well, I think we've seen from a number of countries over the last year or so that's been their goal, and they're just using this as now an excuse to try and get rid of Syrians quicker. Part of the reason why we saw some countries in Europe, like Italy, for example, reaching out to the Assad regime before they actually fell. So now they're using this to try and push that dynamic forward, especially since we saw statements from HTS calling for those that are refugees from Syria to return home and to help build this new state.
And do you think that foreign governments are going to grant recognition to transitional authorities? We've seen France coming out this evening in the last little while saying that they will work with them. What kind of response do you see in the days ahead, in the weeks ahead?
I think most countries will be relatively realistic, especially since the situation still isn't, completely stable. And the fact that unlike, say, the Taliban, which never gave up on al-Qaeda and continues to gaslight people about its presence in Afghanistan, HTS actually went after al-Qaeda and destroyed them. So while they do have a terrorism designation, it's kind of a remnant of the past. Of course, I think there will be some negotiations in that there will probably be some asks by the United States in particular, maybe other countries, that HTS does that could potentially facilitate this. However, it's definitely a sensitive topic because we've never seen in the history since 9/11 that a jihadi group has been taken off the terrorism list while they're still active and not a group that had become defunct.
And Aaron, talk to us a little bit about the impact on the wider region. What we're seeing unfold in Syria at the moment, does it essentially reshape the balance of power in the Middle East?
It's definitely a monumental event that could truly change the geopolitical dynamics in the Middle East. Syria was this key cog in the so-called axis of resistance by Iran, and now if that's blocked off, it hurts their ability to rearm Hezbollah after the beating they got from Israel post 10/7. And therefore, one of the biggest losers in this is probably Iran.
And Russia also, what kind of a blow is it for Vladimir Putin? We see, of course, that Assad, he's been granted asylum seemingly in Moscow today.
Yeah, I mean, there's been this narrative over the years that the U.S. at a certain point will give up on its allies and flee when it's good for them. But now we could say that the Russians are doing the same thing, where Assad was the only key government in the Mediterranean that he had close ties to, and having a warm water port that he was then able to project for their operations into sub-Saharan Africa. So it could severely diminish their capabilities and prestige, but also hurt their power projection because they parlayed they're going into Syria in 2015 to assist the regime and push back against the rebels originally to try and take some of the partnerships away from the United States, such as with Egypt or some of the Gulf states. So it could definitely assist the U.S. in rebuilding some confidence maybe with some of its allies in the region.
And what about Assad himself? If he has been granted asylum in Moscow, it seems that he has. Will he ever face justice?
Considering the fact that Vladimir Putin was, indicted by the ICC and he hasn't had his day in court yet, it's unlikely, unfortunately, that Bashar will, unless he, for whatever reason, tries to travel through certain countries that would likely arrest him. That being said, I would argue that it's important to try and still get him, as well as any other figures involved in this regime, since the level of human rights violations is probably only second to Nazi Germany when we're thinking of the last 70 or 80 years.
And who or what do you believe is ultimately responsible for the fall of the regime of Assad? Does it simply come down to the support that he had been receiving from Russia, from Iran?
I think part of it is that the regime was very much hollowed out by a decade ago, and the Russians and the Iranians, through Iran's Shia militia, helped really assist in bringing back some semblance of the regime through territorial control. But the regime was so stubborn not to make any reforms. And as a consequence, we see what happened, especially since there was such a lightning strike by HTS. And by the time that there was the potential for there to be a counteroffensive, it already became so existential that the writing was on the wall and there was a momentum. And then we've seen what's happened now since, which is quite surprising to, I think, everybody in the world.
And there's still huge uncertainty in Syria, the rebels vowing to maintain state institutions and to restore order. Will they able to be? Do you think they have the support of people behind them? And also, what do you make of the amnesty that has been issued for the Syrian military?
I think that's one of the biggest questions about how they're able to scale up sort of their governance model that they did in northwest Syria over the last 7 years and how they can do that throughout the entire country. We saw them already implementing it on a small scale in Aleppo after they took Aleppo, but now they really have to do it across the board. And that's one of the reasons why there's going to be a transition period between the old regime institutions and turning it into sort of the institutions that HTS already has established previously. In terms of the amnesty specifically, I mean, it's smart. It won't create a problem for HTS. It's sort of, you know, learning the lessons of the failed de-Baathification process that the U.S. did in Iraq, which led to many people without a job and on the streets and, you know, angry. And therefore now people can be free of any worry that they might be prosecuted by a new HTS government, since most of these people that the amnesty is for people who are forcibly conscripted. It wasn't just people that voluntarily did it. And so these people can go back to their normal life and integrate back into Syrian society. And from the perspective of HTS, hopefully give something back to society now.
Many questions remain. Aaron, thank you so much. We'll have to leave it there for now. Thank you so much, though, for your time on the programme. That is Aaron Y. Zelin, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Well, that's it from us.